The desert doesn't lie. It strips everything down to its bare truth, leaving no room for pretense. That's why I've always trusted it more than people. You can't cheat the land, can't outmaneuver the heat, can't sweet-talk your way past a dry riverbed when you're 20 miles from water. It either takes you in or it spits you out, and it doesn't much care which. My name is Samuel Shepard, 58 years old, guide, tracker, and the closest thing this town has to a rescue service when city folks come out here thinking the desert's just another backdrop for their vacation photos. I make my living leading expeditions, finding lost hikers, and teaching people how to respect the land before it kills them. Today was no different. 3 days out with some investment banker and his teenage son, both of them thinking they could buy their way past the desert's patience. They learned quick. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, the father had dropped 10 pounds in sweat, and the kid had stopped rolling his eyes every time I spoke. A good trip. Honest work. Pulling into my driveway, I cut the engine and sat for a moment, watching the late afternoon sun drag long shadows across the yard. The house was quiet, the screen door cracked open, just enough to let in a breeze. I stepped inside, set my gear down by the door, and rolled my shoulders. The familiar scent of home, wood, dust, a faint trace of leather from my old chair, settled around me. Rachel was at the sink, her back to me, rinsing a glass. "You're back early," she said, not turning around. "Wrapped up smoother than expected," I said. Kid handled himself better than his old man. She made a small sound, neither agreement nor interest. Just acknowledgement. The kind of response that had filled the space between us for years now. I walked past her, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, and took a long drink. My eyes landed on a folded receipt near the fruit bowl. Not unusual, Rachel handled the bills, kept things tidy. But something about this one made me pause. An expensive jewelry store downtown. A name I didn't recognize on the purchase line. The date was from 2 weeks ago. I glanced at Rachel. She was drying her hands, moving with practiced ease, like everything was normal. "You pick up something new?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She hesitated. Just for a second. Then she turned, offering me a small, unreadable smile. "Oh, that? No, it was a return. Got credit for it." I held the paper between my fingers. The numbers didn't look like store credit. I let it drop back onto the counter. Huh. She went back to her routine, wiping down the counter like the conversation was already over. I watched her a moment longer, then walked out to the porch, bottle still in hand. The sky was shifting to deep orange, the heat finally bleeding off the earth. I took a seat, leaned back, and stared out at the open land stretching beyond the property. The desert doesn't lie, but people do. And something told me I was about to find out just how deep this one ran. I sat on the porch, rolling the bottle between my hands, the cool condensation slick against my fingers. The sun had dropped lower, throwing long streaks of red and gold across the sand, shadows stretching like reaching hands. The desert had a way of keeping things simple. Either you belonged to it, or you didn't. No middle ground. Inside, I could hear Rachel moving around, the soft clatter of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator door swinging shut. Routine, practiced, controlled. Like nothing was out of place. Like I hadn't just found something that didn't sit right. The receipt sat in the back of my mind, a quiet weight. Jewelry. An expensive place, the kind of store a man went to when he wanted to make a statement. A return, she'd said. Store credit. It hadn't sounded like a lie, not outright. But something about the way she'd said it, it wasn't the words. It was the pause. That fraction of a second where she'd adjusted, recalibrated. Rachel wasn't careless. If there was one thing I knew after all these years, it was that. I stayed outside until the sky turned dark, the wind picking up just enough to cool the sweat on my neck. When I finally stood, my knees popped the way they always did, a reminder that time didn't care how tough a man was. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, the house quiet except for the steady tick of the old wall clock. Rachel was at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea, her phone face down beside her. She looked up when I walked in, eyes flicking over me like she was measuring something. "You eat yet?" she asked. I shook my head. Had jerky on the drive. I sat down across from her, stretching my legs out, feeling the dull ache settle into my bones. "How's work been?" She shrugged. "Busy. The usual." Which meant she wouldn't say more. I didn't push it. Instead, I reached for her phone, flipping it over with one finger, a casual move. Locked screen. But not before I caught the last notification. A name. Brandon Roswell. Rachel didn't react, not at first, but I noticed the way her fingers tightened around her mug. Just a twitch. Who's Brandon? I asked, keeping my voice easy. She didn't blink. A dad from school. His son's in Ben's class. I nodded, tapping my fingers on the tabletop. Yeah? You too close. That pause again. Quick, but there. Not really. We talk sometimes at pickup. Pickup? A 2-minute window where parents barely had time to exchange hellos. I said, leaning back. Seems to message you a lot for just that. Rachel let out a soft breath, not quite a sigh, setting her mug down carefully, like she was considering her next move. Sam, what is this? Just asking questions. Her jaw tightened. Since when do you check my phone? Since when do you have things you don't want me to see? That landed. She looked away, fingers pressing against the edge of the table. He's a friend, she said finally. We talk. That's all. I nodded slowly, watching her, the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. All right, I said. Then I stood, stretched, grabbed a bottle of water from the counter. She watched me move, waiting for something, maybe a fight, maybe a demand. I gave her neither. Just a slow glance, one that said I wasn't stupid, and then I walked out of the kitchen. Upstairs, I didn't turn on the light. Just sat on the edge of the bed, water bottle dangling between my fingers, letting the dark settle around me. The air was still, the only sound the faint creak of the house settling. Brandon Roswell. I'd seen him before, in passing. A fit guy, always dressed casual but put together, the kind of man who made an effort. Always had a kid in tow. The kind of dad who showed up to every event, knew every teacher's name, smiled easy. I rubbed a hand over my jaw. There were ways to find out more, but I didn't need much. Not yet. Instead, I stood, stripped down to my boxers, and got into bed. Rachel came up a little while later, sliding under the sheets without a word, her back to me, like always. For the first time in a long time, I didn't close my eyes right away. Just stared at the ceiling, listening to the slow, measured sound of her breathing. She was lying. I knew it. And she knew I knew it. But we weren't saying it. Not yet. The next few days, I went about my routine like nothing had changed. Woke up early, made coffee, checked my gear. Took a few solo hikes, let the desert air clear my head. The land had a way of stripping everything down, making things simple. It didn't care about doubts or feelings. It just existed, unshaken, unbothered. I reminded myself to be the same. Rachel went about her days like normal, but I noticed the difference. The longer phone calls when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The way she'd linger after school pickup, sitting in the car a little too long before coming inside. I started watching, not obvious, not desperate, just taking note. A man who survives in the desert learns how to read signs. The way wind carves patterns in the sand, the way a man's footprints can tell you if he's in a hurry or if he's got nowhere to be. Rachel was trying too hard to look normal. That was all I needed to know. Late Friday afternoon, I stopped by the library. It was quiet inside, the smell of old paper and worn leather settling into the walls like part of the foundation. Miss Calloway stood behind the counter, her cardigan buttoned up tight, a stack of returns in front of her. She adjusted her glasses when she saw me, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Mr. Shepherd, don't see you in here often. I nodded, stepping closer. Looking for a book. Something on desert survival. Her lips pressed together like she knew I was full of it, but she didn't call me on it. Instead, she walked toward one of the side aisles, expecting me to follow. I did. She ran a finger along the spines, pausing on a thick, worn volume. This one's thorough. Covers tracking, navigation, water sourcing. I took it, flipping through the pages without really reading. You get a lot of regulars in here? Her eyes flicked up to me, sharp despite the quiet demeanor. Some, she said carefully. I nodded like it was just small talk. Rachel's been coming by, hasn't she? A pause, quick but there. She looked at me, then back at the shelves. Yes. She's been in a few times. Alone. She hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already knew. I don't keep track of people's company. Sure you don't. I shut the book and handed it back. Appreciate it. She took it without a word, but I caught the way she watched me as I walked out. That evening, I got home a little later than usual, dust on my boots from a long walk through the outskirts of town. Rachel was in the kitchen, making dinner, moving with practiced ease. She glanced up when I came in. You were out late, she said. Got caught up? I washed my hands, dried them on a dish towel, and leaned against the counter. How was your day? The usual. Took Ben to school, ran errands, went to the library. She said it too quick, like she was proving something. I nodded slowly. Read anything good? She hesitated, then gave a tight smile. Just browsing. I didn't say anything, just watched her move, the way her shoulders tensed under the weight of unspoken things. The next morning, I told her I had an all-day trek lined up, some guy wanting a private lesson in navigation. She didn't ask questions, just nodded, said to be safe. Instead of heading for the trail, I parked a few streets over from the school and waited. Rachel's car pulled in just after noon. Ben had a half day on Fridays, but he wasn't with her. She parked, stayed in the car for a minute, then got out, smoothing down her shirt, adjusting her hair in the reflection of the window. The kind of thing a woman does when she wants to be looked at. Brandon Roswell pulled in 2 minutes later. I sat there, watching, hands steady on the wheel. He got out, wearing a clean button-down, jeans that fit too well for a guy who spent all day chasing kids. He looked around once, quick, before heading inside. Rachel followed. I didn't need to go in. Didn't need to see more. I sat in the car for a while, watching the entrance, watching the world move around them like nothing was happening. Then I pulled out my phone and started setting things in motion. I sat in my truck, the engine off, the heat pressing in. The world kept moving around me. Cars pulling in and out, kids laughing as they ran to their parents, teachers walking to their cars with tired smiles. Normal, everyday life. Except for the two people inside that building, pretending their little secret wasn't about to collapse around them. I didn't move right away. Didn't need to. I wasn't here for dramatics. No yelling in the street, no fists flying. That wasn't my style. Instead, I pulled out my phone and made a call. Hey, Amy, you got a minute? Amy Roswell, Brandon's wife, answered on the second ring. I could hear the hum of a TV in the background, maybe cartoons, the faint clatter of dishes. Sam? Yeah, everything all right. Yeah, just thought you might want a heads up. Your husband's at the library. With Rachel. Silence. Then a careful, steady voice. What do you mean? I could have spelled it out, but she was a smart woman. He pulled in a few minutes ago. She was already here. They went inside together. More silence. This time longer. All right, she said finally. Voice tight. Thanks for letting me know. I hung up. That was all it took. A match against dry kindling. I didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes later, Amy's SUV came rolling down the street. She didn't bother parking neatly, just swung into the first open spot and climbed out, her face set like a woman who had seen enough, heard enough. I leaned back in my seat and watched. Amy walked straight through the library doors, head high, shoulders squared. It was impressive, really. 2 minutes later, the doors flew open again. Brandon stumbled out first, his face red, his whole posture a mess of guilt and excuses. Rachel was right behind him, eyes darting around, hands shaking as she tried to grab his arm. Amy's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. Don't you touch him. Rachel froze, like a kid caught stealing from the cookie jar. Brandon turned, hands up, trying to talk his way out of it. Amy, let's just. Shut up, she snapped. Shut your damn mouth. Rachel glanced around, seeing the people watching from their cars, the folks on the sidewalk slowing their steps. Small town. Eyes everywhere. Amy's voice didn't rise, didn't shake. Just cut clean. You lied to me. While I was working double shifts. While I was keeping our house together. While I was raising our kids. Brandon swallowed hard, his jaw working like he was trying to come up with something, anything, to make this go away. But Amy didn't let him. And you? She turned to Rachel, stepping in close, her voice lower now. What the hell is wrong with you? Rachel opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Amy didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel, walked back to her SUV, and drove off. Brandon stood there, shell-shocked, hands on his hips, looking at Rachel like she was supposed to fix this. Rachel, for her part, looked like she wanted to sink into the pavement. I took my time, gave them a moment to stew in their own mess. Then I started the truck, let the rumble of the engine roll through the air. Brandon turned his head, spotting me across the lot. His face went pale. Rachel followed his gaze, and when her eyes met mine, something inside her cracked. I didn't say a word, just put the truck in gear and pulled away, leaving them standing there, two people who had just realized they weren't as smart as they thought they were. By the time I got home, the house was empty. Rachel's car wasn't in the driveway. I stepped inside, took my boots off, and poured myself a drink. Sat in my chair, letting the weight of it all settle in. I'd done what needed doing. Now it was time for the final piece. The part where I burned it all down. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No sign of Rachel. Not a note, not a message. Just absence. I poured myself another drink, let the burn settle in my chest. It wasn't anger. That had passed. What was left was something colder, something steady. She'd be back. I knew that. She wasn't the kind to disappear completely. Not yet, anyway. And sure enough, a little past 10, headlights swept across the window. Her car rolled in slow, like she thought easing into the driveway might somehow soften what had already been set in motion. I stayed in my chair, let her come to me. The door opened. Soft footsteps across the hardwood. She hesitated in the doorway, like she was testing the air. Sam. I took a sip, kept my voice level. You take the long way home. She stepped into the room, stopped a few feet away. I needed some time. I set my glass down, looked up at her. She was wringing her hands, eyes darting around like there was an answer hiding somewhere in the furniture. That's so. She exhaled, sharp, and for the first time, some of that controlled composure cracked. I know you saw. At the library. I know you. She stopped herself, swallowing hard. Are we really going to do this like strangers? I leaned back, arms resting on the chair. I don't know, Rachel. Maybe we are strangers. Her breath hitched. Sam. I cut her off with a shake of my head. No, don't. You don't get to say my name like it means something right now. She flinched, just a little. For a second, it looked like she wanted to fight. But then her shoulders slumped, and she sat down across from me. Not close, not comfortable. Just like someone waiting for a verdict. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice quiet. I swear to you, Sam, I never wanted to hurt you. I nodded slow. That's the thing about affairs, Rachel. Nobody ever plans them, right? They just happen. She let out a breath, shaky. I was lonely. That got a short, bitter laugh out of me. Lonely. I let the word hang between us. Lonely like a woman who's got a husband that puts food on the table, keeps a roof over her head. Lonely like a woman who married a man she knew damn well wasn't some smooth-talking romantic, but a steady one. Her eyes flashed, some of that fire coming back. You think it's just about money? You think showing up, paying bills, coming home when it's convenient makes you a husband? I stared at her, my jaw tightening. I was good to you, Rachel. I was steady, reliable. I didn't lie to you. I didn't go sneaking around, whispering to some woman behind your back. She looked away, shaking her head. I don't expect you to understand. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Oh, I understand just fine. I understand you wanted the safety, the security. But you also wanted the excitement. The feeling like you were special again. And instead of talking to me, instead of saying a damn word, you found yourself an easy man who'd smile at you and tell you what you wanted to hear. Her face twisted, guilt and anger clashing. It wasn't like that, wasn't it? Silence. She swallowed hard, looking at the floor. I messed up. I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. Yeah, you did. She wiped at her face, but no tears came. Maybe she was saving those for herself later. I stood up, stretched my back. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack a bag. You're going to stay at your sister's place. I'll figure out the rest in the morning. Her head snapped up. Sam, please. Don't, I said, cutting her off cold. I mean it. You don't get to beg. You don't get to cry. You made a choice. Now you get to live with it. She stared at me, lips parted like she had more to say, but nothing came out. I didn't give her time to argue. Just walked past her, up the stairs, shutting the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds below. The rustling of drawers, the slow shuffle of footsteps. And then, a while later, the front door closing, her car starting up, and the engine fading into the night. I didn't feel relief. Didn't feel much of anything. Just the quiet weight of something that had already been broken, now finally set down. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The house felt different without her. Quieter, sure, but not in a way that brought peace. More like the silence after a dust storm. Everything still standing, but you know the damage is there. I sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee that tasted bitter no matter how much sugar I put in it. The sun was barely up, streaks of red cutting through the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Rachel was gone. Good. That was settled. But there was still Brandon. I wasn't a man who went looking for fights, but I believed in making things right. And there was only one way to do that. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in a long time. The line rang twice before a familiar voice came through. Sam. Hey, Mark. I took a slow sip of coffee. You still handling HR over at Carson and Dunley? A pause, then a wary chuckle. I am. Why? You looking for a job? Not exactly, I said, stretching out my legs. I got some information about one of your employees. Thought you'd want to know. Another pause. Go on. I laid it out, clean and simple. How Brandon had been skipping out in the middle of work hours. How he'd been spending company time on something other than his job. How it might not look so great for a firm that prided itself on integrity. Mark exhaled through his nose. You sure about this? Dead sure. He was quiet for a moment, then sighed. I'll handle it. I thanked him and hung up. That was step one. Step two required a different approach. I got in my truck and drove across town, taking my time, watching the world wake up. The coffee shops filling with early risers, the old-timers sitting on benches outside the gas station, trading the same stories they'd told for years. The town was still the same, steady, predictable, just the way I liked it. Brandon's house was in a newer development, one of those cookie-cutter places with trimmed lawns and matching mailboxes. Amy's SUV wasn't in the driveway. I figured she was either at work or taking some time to clear her head. Brandon was outside, pacing, phone to his ear, face tight. He looked like a man whose world was crumbling, because it was. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I pulled up slow, rolled down the window. Brandon. He turned fast, his face going pale the second he saw me. Sam. I put the truck in park, resting an arm on the open window. Got a minute? His eyes darted around, checking for neighbors, looking for an escape. There wasn't one. I don't think. Wasn't a question. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then, like he was trying to find some dignity, he squared his shoulders. Look, man, I know how this looks. I let out a short laugh. I don't think you do, Brandon. 'Cause if you did, you wouldn't have done it. He opened his mouth, closed it again. I let the silence stretch, let him feel it. You ever look at yourself in the mirror? I mean, really look. He blinked. What? You had a good wife. Kids who depended on you. And instead of being the man they needed, you threw it away. For what? A few stolen afternoons? I shook my head. Pathetic. His face reddened. You don't know anything about my marriage. I tilted my head. Maybe not. But I know what you did with mine. That shut him up. I exhaled, tapping my fingers against the steering wheel. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to deal with your mess. You're going to take the consequences like a man. And you're going to stay the hell away from me and mine. His hands clenched into fists. Or what? I smiled, slow and steady. Or I make sure you lose more than just your family. He stared at me, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He knew what I meant. Knew I wasn't bluffing. His shoulders slumped. It's already gone, Sam. All of it. I let that hang between us. Then I put the truck in gear. Good. I drove off, leaving him standing there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Back home, I sat on the porch, watching the sun climb higher. The desert stretched out before me, endless and unchanging. The land didn't care about heartbreak or betrayal. It just was. And now, so was I. It took a couple of months for the dust to settle, but by then, I had already moved on. Not just from Rachel, hell. That part was easy. The harder part was reshaping my life into something better, something that wasn't built on quiet resentment and routine. The house was never really mine, not in the way that mattered. It belonged to her side of the family, passed down, filled with ghosts of arguments we never had loud enough to end things sooner. I sold what was mine, packed up what mattered, and left the rest behind. I bought a small place outside town, just past the last real streetlight, where the dirt roads stretched into the open land. Nothing fancy, just enough, a solid roof, a wide porch, and a workshop out back where I could keep my gear in order. The divorce came and went without much fight. Rachel got what she needed. I got my freedom. She didn't try to drag it out, probably because she had no ground to stand on. She didn't stay in town long after that. Word had spread, because in places like this, it always does. A woman like her, who prided herself on her place in the community, couldn't stand the way people started looking at her. Not with pity. Worse, with indifference. Like she wasn't special. Brandon didn't last much longer, either. Amy took the kids, moved in with her sister 3 states away. I heard he stuck around for a while, but without his family, he was just another guy who'd blown up his life over something that didn't last. Carson and Dunley let him go not long after our talk. Performance issues was the official reason. I knew better. I didn't think about either of them much after that. I had work to do. I started leading more expeditions, longer ones, the kind where people actually learned something instead of just paying for an Instagram photo. I took on a couple of young guys looking for guidance, real guidance, not the kind that came from books and half-assed self-help podcasts. Taught them how to navigate, how to track, how to read the land instead of just existing on it. One evening, I was in town, picking up a few things from the hardware store, when I saw Miss Calloway outside the library. She gave me one of those knowing looks over the rim of her glasses. "You doing all right, Mr. Shepherd?" I smirked. "Better than all right." She nodded, like she'd expected that answer. "Good. Then, after a beat, I have a book for you." I almost laughed. "You still trying to civilize me?" "Not likely," she said, handing it over. A well-worn copy of Desert Solitaire. "Just figured you'd appreciate it." I thumbed through the pages, the weight of it familiar. "You know, I think I had this once." She adjusted her glasses. "That copy was checked out under Rachel's name. It was in the return bin last week." I looked down at it, flipping to the inside cover. There, tucked between the pages, was a small folded note. I didn't open it. Didn't need to. Miss Calloway didn't say anything, just watched as I closed the book, tucked it under my arm, and handed it back. "Thanks," I said, "but I think I'll let the past stay where it belongs." She nodded once, approving. "Smart man." I left the library, the heat from the pavement still rising as the sun dipped behind the hills. Climbed into my truck, turned onto the open road, and drove home. The desert stretched out ahead of me, wide and endless, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the same way.